When a murder's committed, it's always a race against time, to find the truth, to separate fact from fiction, to catch the killer, and to make sure that justice is served. But what happens when the truth vanishes with the victim? I'm Dr. Richard Shepherd, and I've spent my entire career as a forensic pathologist performing nearly 23,000 autopsies, including on some of the most high-profile cases of recent times. I've learned that the dead don't hide the truth, and they never lie. Through me, you'll be hearing directly from the victim.
From a state-of-the-art laboratory with groundbreaking technology that uses digitally scanned sample bodies,
I'll be investigating a series of intriguing murders where, from the victims' bodies, I'll be revealing to you the truth behind those horrific crimes. The start of August 2019, and it was the height of summer. In the small Cheshire village of Padgate, Mark Bradbury is a popular figure. But it's been a few days since anyone's seen him. This is the kind of place where everybody knows everyone else, and it's hard to keep secrets. So when Mark was found murdered in his flat, police quickly realised they had a real mystery on their hands.
Would Mark's body help them to find out the truth about what really happened?
Most murders in the UK are committed by people who are fairly quickly identified as going to be the person responsible, whether it's domestic or gang-related. Mark's murder was different. That scenario whereby somebody's not been seen for a few days and they're found dead, we don't know why, we don't know who they are, what their circumstances are, what their issues would be, where to even begin looking for a suspect. That is really quite rare and presents a significant challenge.
Mark Bradbury was retired and lived on his own, but he was by no means a loner. He was very sociable, with lots of friends and a close family.
Mark was a Warrington man through and through. He had been born here, he'd been brought up here, you know, still in touch with school friends, still in touch with people that he'd known for 25 years, and really grounded in this area.
He lived in a small flat right in the heart of his local community.
It was just him on his own, and it was the ideal spot to be in. Everyone that he knew and loved was all kind of around the area. I would go there after school quite a lot, treated like a princess. He would bring me my tea on, on a tray to sit and watch the television. These little Polaroids are all just memories. My dad and his brother Lee. My dad was fun-loving, happy-going. He loved a party. He loved travelling. My dad used to take me away on holiday. We went to Paris and Rome, Barcelona and Prague, with hope that in 2021 we would go to New York for my 21st and his 60th. This is really how I'd like to remember my dad, walking across the beach with Barney. Everyone trying to persuade my dad not to get Barney a great big golden retriever for his tiny little flat. He disregarded all that. That was his dog. And that's really how I'd like to remember him. Hopefully he is walking on a beautiful beach somewhere.
Mark's brother Lee lived on the same road, and they ended up sharing the dog.
My dad had a lovely relationship with his brother. Lee was retired as well, so he had a little bit more time on his hands. So they just decided that when my dad was at golf or he wanted to go to the rugby match, that Lee would have Barney. They'd always be up and down Station Road, swapping the dog over. And I think that was really nice for them to have that brotherly bond.
On the 1st of August, Mark took Barney through the underpass, met Lee, handed Barney over with the agreement that Mark was coming back to take Barney off him the next day.
But Mark never turned up.
The next day, Friday the 2nd of August, Mark had a dental appointment and Being the massive golf player that he was, he'd cancelled playing golf that Friday to go to this dental appointment. So the consensus of opinion amongst his golfing friends was, this is serious, this is a real toothache, because he would never cancel golf for anything.
But he didn't appear at the dentist either.
On the Sunday, I got in from work and my uncle had sent me a text just to say, you know, hi Hannah, have you heard off your dad? I've not heard off him. He was supposed to get the dog, but he never showed up, and let me know if you get in touch with him. And I was like, oh, for God's sake, he's probably off in golf and just not wanting to have the dog. But I was due to ring my dad anyway, so I started ringing him and I just got no answer. And I thought, God, that's weird. He used to sleep with his phone underneath his pillow, so if he was asleep and I ever rang, he was always there to answer it. So yeah, there was no answer, so I rang again. There was no answer, and at this point I'm now starting to become increasingly concerned.
Lee and Mark's friend, Paul, they went round to the flat and they found it locked. The curtains were drawn and it was clear that there was nothing happening, there was no movement there.
So I went down to the vending machine where I was living and I was just contemplating all the reasons why he wouldn't answer his phone. Nothing was quite making sense. So I typed in the number of the vending machine and this bottle of pop fell to the bottom. And as it did, I really felt a pain that was kind of undescribable, and I raced back upstairs and I said to my boyfriend, I said, my dad's dead. And he went, oh, Hannah, don't be so ridiculous. I said, I can feel it. I said, I can really feel that he's gone.
Mark's former wife had a spare key, so they contacted her and at the same time contacted the police to say, look, we're worried. We're going to go in and see what's happening here.
Lee sent me a text. He said, I'm on the way now. I've got the spare key. So Lee got there and I waited about 40 minutes and I said, Jack, this is not right. Something's really going on. Like, I'm not there. I don't know what to do.
Officers arrived pretty much as they came out, having found Mark, and they were traumatised.
And I rang my mum and she just burst out crying. And she said they'd found him on the floor, and my mum just kept on saying, thank God you weren't here, because my mum was so worried that if I was back in Warrington, it would have been me that would have seen the chaos that was left inside. I went straight back to Warrington to go and see, you know, what was going on. And at that point, I met Sarah Oliver. And she took me into her car and she said, the police officers that were first to the scene can't quite work out how this has happened, and that's why I get called out. That's really stuck with me. I felt in that moment that my life was gonna totally turn. It was like being in a film. I felt like I was watching this happen to me rather than actually living in it. And when the police left, and still to this day I don't know why I did it, but I rang my dad's phone and I left him a voicemail. It's just saying, can you please explain to me how this can possibly happen and how we are going through this? Obviously, I was never going to get a response, but that's all I wanted in the moment, just an explanation.
When I first walked into Mark's flat, he was lying on the floor underneath a loft hatch. There was also some loose change lying around. There was TV still present. The premises had been locked and secured. There was no obvious sign that this was maybe a burglary or an intruder. There was a possibility that he might have fallen out the loft hatch. And yes, the blood was unusual. It was difficult to explain. But nevertheless, at that time, it was determined as suspicious rather than homicide. So it became apparent that it was going to be a massive forensic undertaking. Mark's flat's very small, and at 10 o'clock on the Sunday night, it was quite gloomy. You couldn't really make much of an informed assessment until I'd been able to get a forensic pathologist out to the scene in daylight to have a look at Mark's body.
The main thing about preserving a crime scene is that you don't let a horde of people go in there, especially in a small space, and that you know exactly who went in. So if you get, for example, an unexplained print or mark of some kind or trace of some kind, you can then go back and get reference samples from the people who were there and just check them against them just in case it was one of them.
The next morning, I went into the scene with the pathologist. It was light, it was possible to see Mark. It was possible to see the injuries that he had sustained. And that's when it was escalated to a murder.
An autopsy was performed which showed that Mark had suffered a sustained beating.
which I can show you on this sample body.
He had quite widespread blunt force trauma to his head, his body, with lacerations to the scalp. And as a pathologist, one thing I would always look for also is whether there were any injuries that were caused when Mark tried to defend himself. These are called defensive injuries. And in Mark's case, it was possible to see that there was bruising on the outer side of the arm as the hand is raised to protect the body. The other thing we'd need to look at is to see whether Mark had actually been delivering blows himself. So we look at the knuckles and the backs of the hands to see if he had been punching people. There were no obvious marks found. And although some of the injuries could have been caused by a weapon, no weapon was ever found.
The evidence was clear. Someone was responsible for Mark's death.
I was hoping that there'd be no malice and no ill intentions, and that it might have just been an accident. I was now having to not only go through losing my dad, but it was actually somebody's fault that he was gone.
But then, 2 weeks into the investigation, police discovered a crucial piece of information that would leave Mark's family in shock.
No one, despite what they've done, deserves to be murdered as brutally as my dad was.
In August 2019, a quiet Cheshire village was rocked when Mark Bradbury, a popular local man, was found dead in his flat.
Mark had died after sustaining a brutal beating. But detectives had no idea when this attack had happened. They hoped that, at autopsy, Mark's body would give them some clues about the timeline of events.
The main problem for the investigators in this case is actually quite simple. Time is against them. And as part of my role as a pathologist attending a scene is to begin to make the assessments as to the time of death. And we look at various features of the body. We look at particularly the muscles. We look at how stiff the muscles have become. So rigor mortis is the process that occurs after death when the muscles stop receiving oxygen. And that's a change that starts immediately someone dies and is present in the hands and the feet at about 4 hours and spreads the whole of the muscle mass of the body at about 12 hours and then stays there for another 24 hours, so 36 hours in all. And when we examine the body and we look at the arms, we look at the legs, we look at the mouth, we look at the jaw, we assess the stiffness of all of these areas to get an assessment of when that person died. But later on, other changes can occur, and that happens On the skin, green discoloration of the skin of the abdomen is just about the first thing to happen as decomposition internally changes the body. And then other changes in the eyes. Are they still firm and tense, or are they now beginning to get a bit cloudy and a bit soft? And that too gives us an idea of how long that person has been dead. And all of these changes are temperature dependent. The higher the temperature, the faster these changes are going to take place. And in Mark's case, he died in the summer, locked into his flat. And so temperature is going to play a crucial role in understanding what has gone on. In the later stages of decomposition, hairs and fibres and bloodstains are lost. And that just makes a difficult investigation even more challenging.
After the post-mortem, it was concluded that the murder had happened in the hours between Thursday evening, when Mark was last seen alive, and Friday morning. The police still had no idea who had done it.
When Mark was first found, we were at a total loss as to who could do this to him. And he was just a guy who had a white van and lived in a flat in a quiet part of town. We didn't know him. We didn't know who would want to harm him. So until you know him, you don't know what the circumstances are that might have led to that situation. So that was kind of the first steps, really, is to understand who is this man and why would anybody want to kill him?
Police started examining hours of CCTV, trying to identify anyone who'd been near Mark's flat.
It's a huge time window, and, you know, who was going through? There were hundreds and hundreds of people on CCTV, on bikes, on foot. So it was key to us to get in touch with people and get them to contact us so we could cross-reference against those people on the CCTV and eventually be left with the one man standing.
That went on for what seems like forever. The phone would ring and my heart rate would just skyrocket. Is this going to be the day? Is this going to be the police? Am I going to find out new evidence? Is somebody going to be arrested? It was just living on the edge all the time. And it puts a lot of pressure on your everyday life. When is that phone call going to come?
As the weeks passed, police gradually began to learn more about Mark's life.
There wasn't somebody here with a long history of criminal interactions who might have, you know, enemies and issues going on. And it took some time to build up a picture of Mark's life and start to establish that actually there's another side to Mark.
They discovered he'd been hiding a dark secret, which came as a huge shock to his family.
In the weeks after Mark's death, it became apparent that he used cocaine, and he took cocaine in and distributed it to cover his own costs. And Mark had kept that below the radar. He sold what he needed to sell to cover his own usage. He didn't get into trouble with it. He didn't get involved with violence. He didn't bring any attention to himself, which is how he'd managed to stay unknown to policing systems for so long. You had that side of him going on, you know, and a family that knew nothing about that, and friends who knew nothing about that. They were shocked.
That was the hardest thing, that immediately it went from, oh, you know, he's a poor man, to, oh, well, he was a drug dealer, so that's what he deserved. But that's not the way that I knew him. And that was really difficult to merge these two different men together in my mind that made up my dad.
They had to come to terms with not just the loss, but also they hadn't known him. They'd maybe been deceived by him, maybe, you know, he kept things from them, and that's hard. That's hard to deal with.
I was just in total disbelief. I felt like I'd been lied to. That was really difficult. It hurts me to think that he was potentially leading a double life. And I do think that I could probably have prevented some of this if I knew what was going on.
But Mark's double life provided the first real breakthrough in the investigation.
Finding out that Mark Bradbury actually supplied cocaine and was a user himself really changed things for the investigation team. It was no longer likely to be random. It was more likely to be connected to a real criminal underworld.
Desperate for clues, police began piecing together Mark's last known movements.
At 6 o'clock on Thursday night, he stopped at Bargain Booze and he bought himself a case of beer and a packet of Lambert and Butler cigarettes. And his van was tracked back to his flat, but it never reappeared on CCTV again, and neither did Mark. As we uncovered details about Mark's drugs life, we did start speaking to some of his customers, and one of those customers was the last person to see him alive and gave us absolutely critical information in relation to the layout of Mark's flat and the fact that when she bought cocaine from him, she'd left some cash. Well, there should have been some £10 and £20 notes sitting on a coffee table, and they weren't there.
The investigation team searched for anyone else who had been buying cocaine from Mark. They came across another customer called Dan Shovelton.
During house-to-house inquiries, officers went and visited Dan Shovelton, and it was the first time he'd come into the inquiry. It was early doors, maybe about 3 days in. It wasn't far off, but he was very much just part of the routine house-to-house. There was no expectation or understanding that he had any issue with Mark. They visited him, they asked him when he'd last seen Mark, and he gave what appeared to be a perfectly reasonable explanation that he'd seen Mark about a month ago, and he'd bought some cocaine from him, and he'd paid by bank transfer. And I was quite staggered that in this day and age, cocaine is bought with a bank transfer.
A former sergeant in the British Army, Dan was now unemployed and living less than a mile from Mark.
He'd been successful in the army, spent about 14 years in, and developed quite an expertise, as far as I understand it, in sort of telecommunications and setting up field stations and that kind of activity.
Dan had left the forces to be at home with his daughter. He was having counselling and seeking treatment from a veterans' charity for PTSD.
There were reports that Dan Shovelton was depressed at around about this time, that he'd gone, offline, that he'd disengaged. But he'd left the army, and I think, in all honesty, he expected to be welcomed into civilian life with open arms and given a well-paid employment, using all that skill that he'd accumulated. And it didn't happen. And it didn't happen for a number of reasons. One was his own raging cocaine addiction. The relationship between Mark and Dan, I think, was fairly businesslike. There was probably envy on the part of Dan. Dan sees himself as educated, intelligent, capable. Probably saw Mark as beneath him, wasn't as educated, probably didn't think he was capable. The evidence about Dan's drug habit was that it was enormous, and it probably dictated his existence.
3 months earlier, Dan had lost his job with a courier company after being accused of stealing. At the age of 40, his home had been repossessed and he'd moved in with his parents.
At the time of the murder, Dan was really desperate. He had lost his house. He had nothing in the bank. He had run-up debts with every other drug supplier. By the 1st of August, and the day that we believe Mark was murdered, Dan Shovelton had amassed debts everywhere, well over £50,000. And I think by that Thursday afternoon, he would have done anything for cocaine.
Weeks had passed since the grim discovery of Mark Bradbury's body in his flat in Padgate. Police had discovered that Mark had been a small-time drug dealer.
His body revealed that he had been brutally murdered, but gave no clue as to who the killer was. Mark's body still had secrets to tell.
It became apparent as we investigated the scene that there had been a search. Somebody had been looking for something. We established that Mark had probably got a significant amount of cocaine in his property at the time of the murder. So we quickly reached the point that the drugs were the key. They were probably the reason Mark had been killed, and it was probably because somebody wanted what they couldn't afford.
While detectives searched for clues, Mark's body revealed more details about how he had died.
We know that Mark had suffered quite extensive blows delivered to the head, but because of the decomposition, some of the injuries to the skin and the body couldn't be seen. But when the neck was examined, deep internal bruising and injuries were found. These were seen not only in the muscles of the neck, but if those muscles are removed, and I can do that digitally on this table, the most important thing is revealed, and that's damage to the thyroid cartilage, the larynx, the Adam's apple, which showed evidence of a fracture. And it has spikes sticking up and sticking down that muscles attached to. And it's these that get snapped off. And that showed that Mark had been strangled as well. But because of the decomposition, it wasn't possible to determine if the strangulation was manual or with a ligature.
It was quite sadistic. It was a traumatic way to die. But on top of that, the killer had made sure that had Mark, by any chance, recovered, he couldn't get out. The property was locked, and Mark's phone was switched off, and it was hidden in the mechanism of the settee. So it was a cruel and a sadistic killer that had been able to do that, you know, to kill somebody and then so calmly, coolly make sure that they wouldn't be found and they'd be there for some time, just left.
Detectives didn't have forensic evidence to link anyone to the scene of the murder, but what they did have was a clear motive. Dan Shovelton needed money and drugs, and he knew that Mark Bradbury had both. Dan had told the police he hadn't seen Mark for more than a month before the murder, but CCTV told a different story.
And we had a really good understanding of his movements from CCTV, from his phone records. We managed to build a picture showing that, in fact, on that day, he was circling Mark's house. He was going round time and time again. I had in my mind that he had a question to answer, Dan Shovelton, about why didn't he tell us he'd seen Mark, you know, on the weekend of the murder? Why did he say he hadn't seen him for a month? Before Mark's murder, Dan Shovelton didn't have a penny. He asked his daughter to transfer, you know, £7 or so that he could withdraw a £10 note from a cash point. But then after the murder, he was captured on CCTV going into a large Tesco store and all of a sudden had money. You know, he was buying scratch cards, he was buying alcohol, he was buying lemonade. And he didn't appear to have the same financial constraints that he'd had 4 hours before.
5 weeks after the murder, he was arrested and brought in for an interview.
When Dan was arrested, you know, it's pretty standard stuff, you know, search of the suspect's address. You know, Mum and Dad went and stayed elsewhere, kind of turfed out. Quite devastating for them, really. You know, they're private, proud people whose house is now being searched by the police with all the neighbours watching. His room in particular was searched through methodically, and within his clothing was found a gold ring. So here's somebody that's having to get his daughter to send him £7 so that he can take £10 out of a cash machine, but he's got a gold ring sitting in his pocket.
Mark's daughter, Hannah, confirmed to the police the ring had belonged to her dad.
When I was in Paris with my dad, we were walking up towards the Louvre across a bridge. A man on the street, he was probably a little bit of a con artist, but we give him the benefit of the doubt at the time. He said that, you know, he had no money for his family, so would we like this gold ring? And my dad, not caring really whether it was real gold or not, he took 20 euros out of his wallet and passed it to the man in exchange for the ring. That was in 2015.
What's that about then, Dan? And then, you know, he tries to think on his feet and, oh, I've just been given by Mark. Really? A guy that has really not got any money to spare is not going to give you a gold ring. And yet he's trying to put forward this story about, you know, best mates, give him a gold ring, you know, you get rid of it, you sell it, you get some money for it, and it just didn't make sense. Mark's last purchase was a case of beer and a packet of Lambert and Butler cigarettes. When we found Mark at his house, the case of beer was still there, but there were 2 bottles missing and the cigarettes were gone. When we had our search officers go through the suspect's home address, Dan Shovelton has an empty box of Lambert and Butler cigarettes. We couldn't forensically connect those cigarettes to be the packet that Mark bought, but it was a phenomenal coincidence.
Meanwhile, a thorough search of Dan's internet records revealed something telling.
Interestingly, Dan had Googled me, which is a first. I've not been Googled by a suspect before, to my knowledge. He claimed that he was just curious about the case, but in the next breath, he wasn't interested in the case because he didn't really know Mark and he had no reason to be interested. And he just contradicted himself. For the next few days after the murder, Dan had been out on the road. He then went on a strange journey around Warrington. Areas of water, industrial sites, places where you might have industrial bins. He nicknamed it his magical mystery tour himself, and he never really offered a meaningful explanation for it, whereas the obvious one is that he was depositing, you know, the murder weapon, clothing. He was getting rid of stuff. Mark's flat was a tiny studio with a double bed, coffee table at the end of that, and then a settee. And it was never any different. It was as it was every day to everybody that went there. But when we attended the scene that night, the coffee table wasn't between the end of the bed and the settee. It had been moved and it was underneath the TV. And he was asked as part of that interview to draw a plan of Mark's flat. You know, he'd been there, tell us what it's like, you know, how's everything set out. And he drew the double bed and he drew the settee, and then he put the coffee table between the bed and the settee. And then he changed his mind. And he said, oh, it's not there. And he crossed it out and he moved it to underneath the TV. And at that point, I knew I had my man, and we just needed to prove it.
Detectives were closing in on the killer. But with no concrete evidence to link Dan to the crime scene, they were left with no choice but to let him go.
He was released on bail at that point with the determination that you're going to bring them back and they'll be charged. And it's a worry. What if they go and do something else? So it was a real concern to us that there was a killer on the loose.
Police investigating the murder of Mark Bradbury were certain they knew who had killed him. Former soldier Dan Shovelton was the prime suspect.
Mark's body had shown he'd been strangled and subjected to a brutal beating. and had also revealed when he was likely to have been killed. But police had to piece together the evidence to prove it was Dan Shovelton who had murdered Mark.
The murder of Mark Bradbury was no slam dunk investigation. It was painstaking, it was laborious, it involved thousands of hours of police work. Recovering some 14,000 hours of CCTV, and it involved real attention to detail, layering up all of the evidential opportunities, whether it was forensic, whether it was CCTV, whether it was sightings that were made, whether it was strange activity, but it all had to be pieced together to just present this whole picture, because he was not going to be convicted on one piece alone.
We know that Mark had suffered quite extensive blunt force trauma, but trauma of that type has different effects on different areas of the body. For instance, the abdomen is quite soft, so blows delivered to that area are displaced. The bowel underneath is pushed out of the way, and there's very little bruising. On the other hand, when you look at the skull, which is solid bone beneath the skin, the anvil effect of that blow splits the skin, causing damage. And because there are so many blood vessels, that bit of the body bleeds rapidly and causes quite extensive blood loss all around the place.
In Mark's flat, there was a lot of blood on the floor. And in the blood, there were over 100 impressions of footwear. The killer had spent some time in that flat, moving around and making these footwear impressions. It wasn't a popular brand of footwear. It wasn't immediately recognised by our footwear expert as a Nike or an Adidas or, you know, one of the brands that we see quite frequently. It was something that they'd not seen.
You've got the pattern itself, you've got the approximate size of the shoe, but you've also got things like the wear to the sole, which can be really important, because people walk in different ways and wear their shoe in different ways. And even more critical, if you've got a really good print footwear mark, you can actually see the tiny little nicks and cuts and gouges created by damage that is just, they're picked up in just the course of everyday wear, completely at random, that can actually identify specifically an item of footwear to a mark and actually give you that direct link. It's really amazingly powerful at its best. And of course, if it's got blood staining in it, and you find the mark at the scene and you find blood on the shoe when you locate it, blood on the shoe that matches the victim, then that's a really lovely two-way link.
After some 43,000 records had been cross-referenced, the Lacoste Vanali was identified as the footwear that's left that impression. And it's been out of production now for 8, 9 or more years. But Lacoste made us a pair of those trainers so that we could cross-reference them and show that it is the Lacoste Vanali that's left those footwear impressions.
They now knew the exact make and model of the shoes the killer was wearing at the murder scene. And they also knew he had most likely been searching for drugs. It was an open secret amongst his friends that Mark kept his valuables in a loft above his bed.
It was accessible to somebody of a normal height just by standing on the bed, and you could reach up and you could open the loft hatch. There were bloody footwear marks on the bed, indicating that someone had stood there. And there was some blood on the loft hatch itself, which kind of indicated that here's somebody that they know Mark, and they know Mark in the context of his drugs.
My dad's in his own home and he had no shoes on. So whatever he was doing, he was comfortable in his own home, and he'd obviously invited somebody in. And I think that was the scariest thing for me, that it could be anybody.
The killer entered the loft and they'd searched to the front and they'd searched the sides, but what they didn't find was that cocaine was behind them.
Hunting for the shoes that would link him to the crime scene, police searched Dan Shovelton's home.
We recovered everything from his house. We meticulously catalogued it photographed it, worked out what was there, what wasn't there, and clothing fitting the description that he was wearing on CCTV on that day was not there. Every path we took seemed to lead to a dead end.
But there was one clue, invisible to the naked eye, that would finally link the killer to the scene.
When we arrested Dan Shovelton, one of the items that was seized from his address were the keys to the car. The car itself was obviously also seized and subject to meticulous forensic examination, which revealed nothing. The key was also subjected to forensic examination. And in the very hole in the key that the metal ring passes through, there was a speck of Mark Bradbury's blood.
DNA analysis proved beyond doubt the speck of blood was Mark's.
And that was the only tangible forensic evidence that was recovered in the entire case. Because there was nothing found at the house, there was nothing found in the car, and there was a lot of blood at that house. You know, Daniel Shovelton would have had blood on his hands, literally, and it wasn't to be found anywhere except for that key.
It is extremely difficult to get rid of all traces of evidence, and I think this case is a very good example of that. Using the chemical screening test that we have for blood, it's perfectly possible to test tiny little nooks and crannies on things for the presence of blood. Even when you can't see it, sometimes you get a positive reaction. And sufficient to get a DNA profiling result out of it. So, you know, it's really important to use every kind of tool at your disposal when you think, you know, somebody might have been trying to destroy evidence.
Months of painstaking work had finally paid off. They had literally found the key that solved the case.
Dan was arrested for the second time. He was absolutely dumbfounded, and it was the probably only point where you really saw him flounder, and he couldn't come up with an explanation. So he asked for a break in his interview, and then when he came back, he offered an explanation of having just put the key down and picked up a speck of blood, you know, in transfer, which was farcical, really.
Finally, there was enough evidence and Dan Shovelton was charged with murder. But in court, he continued to deny it.
It was really difficult attending the trial. You have to listen to both sides of the story, and there was no real answers from somebody who still pleaded not guilty.
It was clear that Dan Shovelton had barely told a word that was true throughout the entire investigation and throughout the entire court case. I think he remained committed throughout the trial to an innate belief that he'd walk away.
The jury were having none of it. After 11 hours of deliberation, they found him guilty.
I can't really describe the emotions. You've got this wave of relief that, you know, he's been convicted, that all of that work has paid off. Pleased for Hannah, she'd got an outcome, you know. It makes you feel quite glad, but then you shouldn't feel glad because somebody's been murdered and somebody's now going to prison for years. It was a case that had tragedy on all sides.
Dan Shovelton was convicted and sentenced to life in prison. For the investigators and for Mark's family, there was justice at last.
I will fight for him to stay in prison longer. Why did he feel the need to beat him to an extreme? I want to know what my dad was saying in those last moments. I can't help but think that he was just begging for his life, and that this death was truly painful. I don't think he ever doubted for a second that he still wasn't the best dad, because he gave me everything that he could have done.
Investigating the murder of Mark Bradbury is something that I'll always be really proud of. Police officers, civilian staff, forensic staff, scientists, all of them, you know, put heart and soul into this. The effort and energy put in by the entire investigation team was staggering.
This was clearly an enormously challenging investigation, and one that proves that it's the first hours after the discovery of a murder that are absolutely critical.
Mark's body was able to tell the truth about the beating and strangulation. And the brutal beating he took, especially the blunt force trauma to the head, meant that there was too much blood for Dan Shovelton to be able to clean it all away. And for Dan Shovelton,
it was the discovery of a single fleck of blood, invisible to the naked eye on a car key, that was to be his downfall. That and the painstaking and determined police investigation.